Yeesh, this is London's Free Thinking Comedy Club. That does not mean that we are here to be offensive. It just means that we are here to laugh at comedy, understanding that none of this is meant specifically to be about you fucker. It's not about you! Isn't it? Oh, that's very disappointing. I'm so sorry, madam.
Hello, this is the Comedy Unleashed podcast. I'm Andrew Doyle. We are backstage, and I'm with Simon Evans, who is going to go on and headline the night. How are you, Simon?
I'm fine, Andrew. I take it you don't want me to destroy the illusion of backstage.
It's not really backstage. I was trying to, you've broken the spell.
We're in a sort of lavatorial and facilities, I don't know, like the kind of household cavalry of the cleaning brigade, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think they expected us to be anywhere palatial, particularly.
No, podcasts don't have a smell dimension, do they?
No, well, ours definitely doesn't, no. But, I mean, it's better than some green rooms I've been in, let's be honest.
Yeah, they're very often, I don't know that people have a heightened idea of the glamour attached to stand-up comedy these days.
I think they do, but they're misled. So, lovely to see you.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk to you a bit about politics, because you've recently had a Radio 4 show which is about the free market, am I right?
Yes, well, it was about economic theorists. We've done 5 series now of Simon Evans Goes to Market, and the first 4 series were about the economics of certain things, for instance, gold or the housing market or death or tobacco or whatever. And then for series 5, we decided to go into theory, which was a lot more challenging to make palatable and
I was going to say, how do you make it funny?
Yeah, I went into the sort of lifestyles. So we did Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and John Maynard, Keynes, and then for the 4th episode we tried to look to the future. But for each of those 3, we tried to sort of zero in on their biographical details because there was more potential for a bit of human, hopefully finding the disparity between their pronounced ideologies and their actual living circumstances and so on, the way they behave. You know, Marx being the most obvious target for that kind of thing. But Keynes himself, I mean, extraordinarily rich life. Why nobody has yet produced a sort of 12-part, beautifully produced period costume drama about Keynes's life? I mean, he was the equal of Churchill or anyone.
But they become like symbols, don't they? They become like ciphers. They sort of people don't really think of them as people.
I don't know whether people think about Keynes very much, but in his day, I mean, he transcended economics. He was a member of the Bloomsbury Group. He was an extraordinarily successful. How can I put this? His sex life was sufficient to hold a television audience on the thick rats for 12 hours. His commingling with British, continental, and American politicians was without parallel. Marx, by comparison, was almost like a sort of darkly penciled graphite sort of caricature of a curmudgeon,
but then became
trudging off to the British Library every day. And it was 50 years after his death that his policies finally caused allowed the rain of benevolence to shower down upon humankind.
But someone pointed at his flat in Soho the other day as we were walking through. It's funny, but he's been sort of deified, though, hasn't he?
Well, in certain. He's a very interesting character, Marx, because I think it is fair to say he was a tremendously vivid writer. He's quite poetic prose as economics goes, and his early stuff, especially the Communist Manifesto, is certainly worth a read. Capital is burdened by he gets a bit too swamped in the mathematics of it all, which is very often what happens when people try too hard to I think economics is best treated much more like a sort of religious revelation. You can then try and create the sort of scaffolding, the infrastructure afterwards, but the initial sort of insights almost have to come to you as if in a dream. And he had that early on, and then he tried to support it with endless expositions as to the interplay of capital and labour and so on, and it all became extraordinarily hard and dense. But, I mean, he is the most divisive figure in history, I would imagine, really, or certainly of the 21st century of a figure from history.
Well, it's because
there's nobody else outside of religion who divides people as, who think either a visionary, we must try and realise Marx's vision, or we must accept that every single time that has been attempted, it has led to calamity.
Jeremy Corbyn is a man of extraordinarily and I'll be honest, I took him to be a suicide note in human form when he first emerged into my consciousness due to a strange quirk in the Labour rules, but again, you're probably aware of this. 2 E's at A-level, that's E's, I'm saying. That's not a strange accent. The 5th letter of the alphabet, E. 2 E's at A-level. Failed to complete his degree course at North London Polytechnic, whatever fucking degree course you can get onto with 2 E's. Was still too much of a grind for the old cunt. He pulled out and immersed himself in student activism, where he remains to this day, essentially. And it is unconscionable. He's within grasp of number 10, and they have to account for that. And the only reason I learned about this was the 2017 general election, which was the most ham-fistedly handled political event of my lifetime, I think. An absolute fucking cattle drive. I mean, it was extraordinary, wasn't it? Theresa May, the Maybot, of course, has already been exposed and talked about her interview after interview, just exposing people for their short. Diane Abbott almost physically dragged off by a shepherd's crook halfway through after failing to add up 3 single-digit figures to produce a plausible police budget for the following year. Jeremy Corbyn actually got off fairly easily. The only people to really attack him, funny enough, was BBC's The One Show. I don't know if you ever watched this, some of you may have jobs, but The One Show... roughly 6 o'clock in the evening on BBC One, nice little sort of cosy tea time chat. They normally have Giles Brandreth on, you know, he's like, that's the... And I like Giles, he's usually visited some cathedral, done some brass. That wouldn't surprise me if he's behind that Novichok business, to be honest, Brandreth. He's in and out of fucking Salisbury like a rat up a drain pipe. But anyway... he'll have it on his shoes, I promise you. On this occasion, the thing was given over to an interview with Jeremy Corbyn, and they slipped it in. They were chatting away about brass rubbings himself. You know, he likes his manhole covers and the allotment and all that. And then one of them said, "Is it true, Jeremy? 2 E's at A-level, no degree? That's an unusual path for a would-be Prime Minister, isn't it?" And he said, "Yes," he said, "that's true. I was never very academic," he said. Not looking remotely embarrassed any more than if he'd just been shown a photograph of him having a picnic with Osama bin Laden. As if it was like an optional extra. Not very academic. Now listen, you don't need to be academic to make a useful contribution to the world, obviously, but, you know, just for the sake of argument, I think, broadly speaking, in order to be successful academically, you need to be able to consume written materials, absorb arguments and so on, and facts, and understand what is laid out, and attend discussions, tutorials and seminars and so on, and possibly contribute to those, and possibly synthesise different arguments and understandings of the world, and create a new possibility and a way forward, and communicate that through the skills of It's a pretty fucking close correlation for being Prime Minister, as a matter of fact. You nail that and a nice coat for Remembrance Sunday, you're halfway there, really. Never very academic. A fucking disgrace, honestly.
And there's so much heresy within the cult. I mean, I've seen so many people sort of deny that other people are real Marxists, or, you know...
Yeah, true Marxism never been tried and so on. I mean, that's the end. But, of course, it hasn't. That is a fair point. It certainly wasn't in Russia. The thing about Marx, there are a number of things about Marx, but one obvious thing about Marx is he didn't really detail a solution. He spent most of his energies and focus on analysing the flaws of capitalism and why it would inevitably collapse, why it would inevitably consume itself. It was like pop will eat itself, but for the 1840s, you know. And it was accurate in that respect, except he underestimated its ability to mutate in response to every time. So we have had a series of crises. There's no escaping that fact. You know, capitalism has led to some tremendous crises, but capitalism itself mutates endlessly in order to adapt to them. Whereas he thought it would lead catastrophically to a crisis from which everyone would realise, well, this isn't working, we need to seize the power, seize the means of production, share it out equally. We have a vanguard, we have a brief period of state capitalism, and then you know, everyone gets a fair share. And of course that's never ever happened. And as soon as anyone gets any kind of power, they immediately shore themselves up within it. And
you can understand the idealism, you know, and the wish that could be true.
Well, you certainly can understand it in industrial, you know, the Industrial Revolution and the aftermath of that in the big cities. I mean, where Engels was walking around, people like point at the hypocrisy and the irony of Marx being funded by his well-off industrialist mate. But Friedrich Engels, who was also a very talented prose writer, you know, was genuinely moved, I think, by the working conditions he saw of the factory that he'd inherited. I mean, it's very hard to just throw that all away, but he was poetic in his descriptions of it, and it was extraordinarily awful. And it's quite easy nowadays, of course, for modern economists, as they do when they look at Vietnam or the Philippines or whatever, to say, well, you know, you think they work in sweatshops, but actually, you know, there's actually much better working conditions for them than it used to be in the paddy fields or whatever. It's kind of fucking horrendous, really. You know, I mean, they really were. There is at least a certain kind of natural squalor in agricultural poverty, you know, the industrial poverty that gripped Britain and the Industrial Revolution was over 100 years of brick dust and smoke.
Yeah.
I mean, really hard. It varied from one place to another. The mines were probably worse than London.
So with that in mind, how do you make this stuff funny? How do you make it accessible? That is the big challenge.
I made Marx. I found Marx the hardest one to make funny. It's certainly Tim Harford, who was our resident economist who lends show credibility. He said he found making Marx even digestible or approachable was very difficult for him. He is a PPE graduate rather than pure economics, but he finds Marx very complicated, and he hasn't, to be honest, found it worth the effort. He just went, he's been proved wrong time and again. It's too dense. And so he's never really got his head around it himself. But
your target audience for this radio show, presumably is very different from the target audience you do for a comedy club. Or not necessarily different audience, but a different way to approach it.
Different tone, yeah. The 6:30 comedy slot on Radio 4, although increasingly, of course, podcast, versions or Sounds app. Mm-hmm. My personal view is that they do actually want something with a bit of substance to it.
Yeah.
My personal take is that Radio 4 is occasionally prone to, I don't want to slag any individual off, obviously, but just a little bit slightly sort of vapid or vacuous.
Right.
Just laughs, just laughing.
Yeah.
Whereas actually I think people look to Radio 4 for something with a little bit more fibre and grist.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think comedy audiences generally as well. I think people do want something with substance. And
I agree, they have appetite. People were always underestimating people. They will rise to it.
Well, they did it with the podcast. People were saying that people's attention span wasn't good enough for long form, and now the podcast has taken off, and that's actually what people want.
You look at Joe Rogan, that is over 1 million hits per episode.
What is it? It's like 2.5 hour, 3 hour shows.
Amazing. And to be fair, I generally, I listen to it. The great thing with YouTube is you can speed it up now, of course, which is great for podcasts and things. If you have a podcast app, I use Pocket Casts. I imagine they're all sort of similar.
Yeah.
You can eliminate all the gaps and speed it up. You can listen to what was a 40-minute conversation in about 25 minutes without losing any of the sort of coherence. The brain's ability to process it doesn't go. You can't do that with TV shows. And I think a lot of semi-factual TV programming has, if anything, gone in the other direction. I remember when BBC Horizon programs used to be, quite educational. Now it's basically lots of long shots of the sun rising over a fucking particle accelerator or something. You just go, come on, where's some information?
Yeah.
Anyway, so Radio 4 comedy, benefits from that. And you've got an audience who will sit there and they will pay attention. And hopefully now, 5 series in, I felt, we've gathered enough momentum, we've gathered, accrued enough credibility, people will sit with it. So far, all the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, but I suppose people wouldn't, tell me to my face that they'd found it boring. But, people have gone out of their way to say, we've found that really interesting and I did learn something,
Yeah.
And you're right. It's easy for me to take for granted that people know who Adam Smith was, beyond being on a £20 note, but it's not the case. There's a lot of things.
Actually, the audience here at Comedy Unleashed, they're quite politically literate, so that in that sense, it is quite good. But of course,
they are unusual. I haven't been on yet, but I've just watched the first half hour, and it's very unusual. They're quite mature for a start. I don't mean like old, but they're in there's plenty of people in their 30s. At least a lot of Central London comedy nights now, more late teens, early 20s. You know. They are a lot of them are Londoners, which I think is healthy, without wishing to sort of sound controversial about it. Go to the Comedy Store, at least half the audience are tourists, really, and many of them from overseas, and they're kind of in the way that people go to Vegas or something, They're just to see the spectacle. They're not invested in the night in the same way that, it's a bit of a local club. It's great, that is really good to feel that you can probably, people's attention spans will stick with it.
And it's nice that we get some people coming back again and again, and, that's the idea. And we do try and get a range of different stuff.
I'll be honest with you, when I first saw the title, Unleashed, and you can say anything, there is that kind of, Rick Mail, I'm mad me kind of thing. And you think, oh God, is this really necessary? Is it self-indulgent nonsense? But overwhelmingly, I felt that it's actually demonstrated that it is necessary and it is worthwhile. And also, actually, even in the sort of last 6 months, increasing amount of, just like little, it's always the death of 1,000 cuts, isn't it? But little impinging on the liberties, you can't say that, you're cancelled here, you're banned off.
And it is small things. It's not I keep getting accused of saying, you're going around saying you can't say anything anymore, which is not a phrase I've ever used, apart from just now to you. Yeah. But
that's Stuart Lee thing, isn't it? Oh, you can't even say you're British anymore or something. They were saying you had some sort of satire on it.
I don't think anyone actually says that.
No, it's nonsense. It's that way of that kind of straw manning of things is very irritating because there is a Puritan drift, at the moment, and it's wrong.
So one of the questions I always get asked is, what do you think of the state of satire? this is like a really standard question. I don't know why, but do you have an answer? Because I really hate answering that question. So I was wondering if you could give me an answer I could use.
I do think certain gatekeepers have, I mean, you know, the long march through the institutions might be exaggerated, but it does feel to me like the left have managed to get a firmer grip on the gates. Obviously, some people are producing this stuff, but you are like 10 times more likely to get suspended from Twitter, for instance, for crossing a line in that direction, you know, where there's plenty of people who like go, God, I hate white people, you know, and next minute they're hired to the editorial board of the New York Times, you know. I mean, that's a literal example, as I'm sure you know.
That is true, but then if the people in power have redefined what racism means, it doesn't. It's what is it they say? It's prejudice plus power. It's
plus institutionalized power. That's exactly. That's right. So, you know, and this is an evolving question, but I think satire is, you know, the thing about satire is it's like weeds. It will burst out through any tiny crack in the concrete, you know. You just have to keep an eye open for where it's emerging right now. And just at that moment when you start to lose confidence and faith that, you know, the MASH report is capable of presenting a balanced, you know, a take on a certain scandal, you know, it will suddenly emerge from somewhere else, you know. Yeah. I mean, Jeff Norcott is doing a good job, bless him, as, you know, attempting to balance things, but he is quite clearly the token. They've almost made it explicit how token he is.
No, they really have, haven't they? But that's weird to me because, I mean, often comedians deny to me. They say there's no left-wing bias in comedy. There's no...
I remember I was asked onto the Now show for their Brexit special on the Sunday before the vote, and it was a guy called Ed Morris, lovely guy, who's a radio producer who was involved in it. I don't think he was the producer, might be wrong. Anyway, he said, will you come on and debate with Lucy Porter about pro or against Brexit?
Right.
And I said, which one do you want me to do? Because I was genuinely neutral. I hadn't been tweeting or campaigning either way. I'd had conversations with my dad, who was a Leaver, and when I sort of understood his concerns about the, you know, creeping, you know, drift towards political unity. And then I had conversations with other people saying it does work as, you know, it's blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, oh, whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, I said, yeah, fine. So I drew up like there were 4 questions and I wrote 4 responses. You know, it would be like, why, you know, what have you got against Europe? And I said, I've got nothing against Europe. I just distrust, you know, an unnecessary tier of management, and my distrust of it. That comes from my days running the sixth form block when I was at school, you know, because I know how much I was creaming off from the profits of the pool table. And it was like this. Anyway, I went along and did that debate with Lucy, and that was in front of a Radio 4 audience at the Radio Theatre, and I was literally the only pro-Brexit voice on that night, and I wasn't even sincerely pro-Brexit myself. I'd just written them as comic conceits. I won the debate massively. The audience was so desperate and relieved to hear a pro-Brexit voice that night, you know, even though it was all tongue-in-cheek. I mean, my final point was, you know, that I wanted us to leave Europe because I had my father, who I was very fond of, keen aviation enthusiast, and one of his great laments was that this country only properly invests in the aviation industry when there's a war in the offing. During the build-up to the Second World War, we created the Spitfire and the Mosquito and the Hurricane and so on, but the investment just leaks out afterwards. We always have the innovators, we always have the technology, and then it goes away to America in order to get built and developed, only during a war, and ideally a war with Germany. So as long as we're inside the EU, that just isn't possible. But if we pull out, there's just the possibility of a war. You know, it was on that level of nonsense, you know. Let's call it nonsense. But anyway, you know, 4 days later, we vote to leave. And I did wonder whether, oh my God, did I tip the balance?
You definitely swung it. You definitely swung it.
Am I taking the blame? But it was just extraordinary. You have no one, there's no other balance at all. It was all Marcus Brigstock and
the audiences are relieved, you know, I think. Even if they have a particular point of view,
absolutely.
You know, they just want to hear the different sides. I think people are bored with not being surprised.
My only strong view on Brexit is that it is taking far too long to achieve a result. It is taking longer to detach politically from Europe than it did geologically. I think that's there is no fucking excuse for that, is there? We could at least at this point surely switch to a news medium more appropriate than the 24-hour news cycle to keep us up there. Maybe a fucking tapestry or something. You could just, with a webcam, you could just log on and see how the tapestry was coming on. Oh, look, they finished Michel Barnier's tie. It's obvious obviously been very divisive. It has revealed divisions and possibly inflamed them. But one of the divisions that I don't like, revealed and the inflammation of, is the division between young and old. This is one that particularly begins to rile me, because I'm 54 years of age and I can begin to feel the first little creaks in the bones and the first little lacunae in the mental processes that indicate I'm entering a later stage of life. And it's no country for old men, Brexit, is it? Because you're despised. I mean, this is a country, we are a country, basically, and most of Western civilization is, that doesn't have a very healthy attitude with ageing and with death. We don't have a very switched-on attitude to mortality, do we? I have wondered whether, as a comedian, it is my responsibility to attack these taboos. I've wondered whether I should do a show about the death of my father and the impact that, obviously, the reflections at such an occasion will cause in a man confronting his own mortality in his late middle age. The truth is, I think it would make a perfectly valid subject matter for a stand-up comedy show. I wouldn't shy away from it, but every time I sit down to try and write jokes about the death of my father, I find I'm unable to do so without that event actually having taken place. It's a failure of imagination more than anything else. Should at least be able to see that far into the future, shouldn't I? Jesus. He's 89 years old. I mean, it's hardly unconscionable, but he is alive. He's on his feet. He has his marbles, bless him, and he follows my career, and he will sue. So there's no point in... I actually have a great deal of time for the old man. He is 89, and he's what you would expect, I suppose, from a lot of men of that age. They live out in rural Norfolk, my parents, both still together. They celebrated their 60th anniversary recently. I'm very proud of that and very grateful to them for providing that stability for me. And I'm grateful, to be honest, that they're still there to talk to, get a bit of perspective on things. I enjoy that regular phone call. It's the one conversation I have on a weekly basis where I feel like I'm the liberal. That's nice for me, you know? I'm the one going, well, hang on, Dad, they're not all like that. You know? So that's welcome. I enjoy it. He was blamed, my dad, for Brexit, and there is a large and trenchant body of people of opinion in this country, all based on facts, of course. It was all statistical analysis of the demographics that lay beneath the Brexit divide, and it was discerned that a particular demographic was largely responsible for Brexit, namely old people, retired people living in rural Britain away from the realities of the modern, urban, sophisticated urban economy, old white men, basically, and principally the uneducated, by which they mean no university degree, no tertiary education. These people much more likely to vote for Brexit, it seems, statistically. Now, my father does fall very neatly into that category. He is uneducated. He would admit it himself if he understood the question. But he's not thick. He's not ignorant. He's uneducated because he left school in 1944. It wasn't a given then that if you could stand up straight and not piss your trousers in front of three fucking non-entities at Warwick University for 10 minutes, you were granted the opportunity to read media studies and emerged 3 years later 50 grand in debt, less employable than you were when you went in. That wasn't considered a good start in life. He's read a newspaper most of the days of his life, and he's kept a fairly close eye on the... He was an enthusiastic Remainer back in 1975. He voted to stay within the... I think it was still called the European Chess and Bridge Association or something. There's been a bit of mission creep since then, and he didn't like it. Luckily for us as a family, on this evening, of course, it feels like I probably would get away with it. But luckily, generally speaking, in terms of my career, my mother rendered the family Brexit neutral. She is a Remainer. She is educated. She got an Open University degree in her 50s. So maybe there's some correlation, I don't know. But I don't think that's why she voted Remain. I don't think she voted Remain because she's read Jane Austen and George Eliot. I think she voted Remain because she has a deep-seated loathing of Boris Johnson. And it really is that simple. It's a very visceral dislike. He comes on the telly, she starts hissing like a fucking cat. She doesn't trust him. I don't think it's the politics, because the only other person she's ever hated that much was Arthur Scargill, so I think it's the hair. I don't think she trusts men with an unruly mop and political ambitions, and I can see that. I can see that it's affected, and I have some sympathy with that view. She really does, despite, honestly, it wouldn't surprise me next time I see her, she's wearing a fucking burqa, just to spite Johnson. That wouldn't be surprising. Which would amuse my father, because he's always complaining it's a long walk to the post box. So it'd be a bit of an own goal. I don't know how that would play out. But cause a bit of a scandal in the village. I have respect for them, and what I really respect about my parents is that, and that generation generally, they take their democratic responsibilities very seriously. They don't go on marches, they don't wear stupid t-shirts to the pub proclaiming that. They fucking get out and vote, though, when it counts. This is what matters, getting your vote in. They both went out, they both had mobility issues, they got on the bus on that June morning 3 years ago, went to the polling station, cast their votes, knowing that their votes would cancel each other out. They were aware of that. They'd had that conversation on a nightly basis, and they knew they had failed to persuade the other one. I don't know if they were just hoping they'd have a heart attack on the bus or something. Do not resuscitate until 10:01 p.m.
The thing is, with left and right, that's one thing, but Leave and Remain has brought it into much starker focus, because the Leavers are basically the social conservatives, aren't they? That's the thing, and that's the quarter that's been ignored. You know, you've had the sort of, you can talk about fiscal, for want of a better word, you know, left or right, you know, redistribute taxes, whatever, but the top left-hand corner of the compass are the ones who just felt they weren't seeing their views like even engaged with, you know, just outright mocked as absurd and futile and facile and clown-like, you know, for so many years. I think they took the opportunity to you know, with the Brexit vote, to just, you know, chuck a brick through the stained glass window.
To what extent do you think class was an issue? I mean, there's a feeling of which there's a kind of weird alliance between the very rich and the working class, you know. Well,
I do think, class evolves again, but it is still a factor in Britain, and obviously it still is in America, despite the fact that they claim not to be class-ridden. You know, they're more racially divided than they are class-divided, I suppose, and so that grabs the headlines. But we have a problem in this country, which is that there has been, and I think it's quite a recent thing, and it is, again, it's like the coastal elites. We are starting to get that now, that kind of sense that there are certain people, technocratic, you know, individuals who understand more complex and sophisticated ideas of how things should be run. Yeah. And I'm not saying it's wrong. There's a guy on Twitter, Christian Niemitz, who made a very good point recently that essentially Hong Kong, up until the Chinese handover, was run essentially by a technocrat, a Scottish economist. I can never remember his name. He ran an amazingly successful economy and society. I mean, I wouldn't want to live there.
But you can't guarantee you'll get the right technocrat.
No, exactly. That was the thing. But he was essentially a libertarian technocrat. Right. His thing was, I don't want reams and reams of statistical analysis of the economy, because you will expect me then to intervene in this way or that way. Just let it be. It's working. Yeah. That he was that kind of technocrat. You know what I mean? But my view with Brexit is it may or may not work, it may or may not be a bump, but I look back to all the other things that have been similar in history, like, for instance, Martin Luther, you know, the break with Rome there in Germany, you know, the 30 Years' War, a catastrophe for Europe, you know, an outbreak with Rome under Henry VIII. None of those things, they were all basically peasant interventions, essentially. People rising up against their betters, you know, for whatever.
Well, even the English Reformation?
Well, I think so, yeah. Just if it's seen on a world scale, Henry VIII's break from Rome, that was seen as the British vulgar, you know, a vulgar kind of, you know, that's how the Catholic Church saw it. They didn't see us as equals at that point. They saw us entirely as this kind of race of, you know, island, you know, Atlantic barbarians.
Not without cause, perhaps.
No, absolutely. Well, the Spanish and and prior to that, the Holy Roman Empire were much more splendid and sophisticated. I mean, they were essentially, you know, much more, and that continued even into the 17th, 18th, 19th century. It wasn't a coincidence that Austria and Germany had Beethoven and Mozart, you know, and we didn't.
Who did we have?
In music, we didn't. I mean, we had great painters. Well, I'm not saying it was entirely uncultivated, but there's a certain amount of sort of vulgarity at the heart of the British people, you know. But would you really want to go back and turn back the clock and say, no, we should have stuck with Rome, we should have remained?
Well, I'm a Catholic, so 100%.
Well, you're okay.
Yeah.
You're a bit.
Because I'm going to go to heaven.
Of course, some of the most traditional and, in a funny way, sort of Brexity people on Twitter are. I mean, the trad Catholic thing is coming back.
Right. It is right. I've noticed that.
It's weird what people make alliances with.
So, where do you find yourself politically? If you were to describe yourself politically, do you have an allegiance?
No, I really don't have an allegiance. I genuinely am interested in understanding different arguments. I see certain names and theories sort of emerge. mainly on Twitter, which is where I spend far too much time, and I try and educate myself about them. For instance, recently I did read up on somebody who really is quite right-wing, a guy called Karl, who was a German jurist and sort of political philosopher of roughly the 20th century, who was a member of the Nazi Party, although he was not entirely in favour of it, but he didn't kind of get exiled from it or whatever. But he wasn't ever sort of put through Nuremberg or whatever, and he continued to function afterwards as well. And the Americans were quite interested in what he had to say. But he had sort of deep, intellectual underpinnings of nationalism and that kind of thing. It's worth understanding what those are, because it's very easy to just dismiss nationalism as just sort of brute force, just knuckle-dragging ignorance,
Yes.
Whereas, in fact, it's useful to know. But equally, I am very interested in Georgism, for instance, which is the land value tax, where you just say income tax is a suffocating, oppressive weight on the burden of innovation and energy and enterprise. Whereas instead, if you just tax the value, the rateable value of land, it naturally disperses the burden across those who can afford to pay it through no credit of their own. It's not your own virtue that you live in a part of London that's become extraordinarily desirable. So that's considered quite a left-wing proposition.
Are you saying you go through Twitter for all this? This is where you...
Well, I encounter a lot of people who discuss these things, and then I go, and that's why I sort of say to them, well, what should I read? What would be an interesting...
This sounds like a good way to use Twitter rather than just insult people.
I do also, have furious rows with people about whether it should be Kenneth Williams who plays Hannibal Lecter in the remake of the Ealing comedy version of... That was today's one. It wasn't furious, no, it was very good-hearted, but we were discussing if they made an Ealing comedy version of Silence of the Lambs, and as of course Kenneth Williams is a British comedy movie, like a carry-on Ealing comedy, I was thinking, I said Alec Guinness because he has that kind of, he can do sinister brilliantly, it's like in The Lady Killers, but...
Charles Hawtrey?
Hawtrey would be, it's a sort of one joke note, isn't it?
Although, if you watch Hawtrey in the Carry-Ons, he's always acting, he's never off.
Yeah.
He's always right in the background. He's always really...
Well, very, very damaged individual by all accounts.
Well, all of them.
Pleasant man. That was such a generation, wasn't it? Extraordinary. But we all agree that Bernard Bresslaw made an amazing... What was his name called? The one who kept him in the hole in the ground. Billy he was named after the cowboy, wasn't he? I can't remember what his name was.
One of the Carry-On films with Bresslaw.
Bernard Bresslaw is the massive tall guy. But in Silence of the Lambs, there's the
Buffalo Bill.
Buffalo Bill, exactly, yes. So Bresslaw plays that in drag.
Bernard Bresslaw as Buffalo Bill.
Yeah, but there's a picture of him in drag, which this guy sent me to convert, and I was like, actually, that is terrifying.
Well, you know what?
Where he touches himself in between his thighs.
Bernard Bresslaw, although Bernard Bresslaw did play the Cyclops in Kroll, so he's got form of being...
Did he?
He's got more of a range than people give him credit for.
Yeah, absolutely. Range, and quite a wingspan as well. I don't know that I've seen Kroll. I can never remember.
Oh, it's one of those old 80s fantasies.
Yeah. I did see one with a Cyclops in, so it must have been that one. That's where he can foresee his own death, isn't it? Yeah, that's
Bresslaw, but you can't really tell because he's got the makeup on. It's Bresslaw, yeah.
Massive.
Unless I've got it completely wrong. Anyway, Simon, on that note... on the note of tucking in a penis and...
But yes, use Twitter to engage with unusual perspectives and I've talked to some left-wing and right-wing... Americans in particular, there's some probably switched on intelligent people on the right that will make you realise it is, it's not idiotic.
That is actually genuinely good advice to end the podcast with. So thank you very much for joining us. I look forward to your set.
Yeah, it's going to be a massive disappointment. So, tits and bums, am I right?
Thanks, Simon.
Right, that's it for now. Check out the Comedy Unleashed YouTube channel or Facebook page. We're also on Twitter. And if you'd like to see the full lineups for future gigs, check out comedyunleashed.co.uk. We hold gigs on the second Tuesday of every month, and it would be great to see you there. Lastly, don't forget to click on the subscribe button for the Comedy Unleashed podcasts, and then as we drop new interviews with comedians as they come off stage or are about to go on stage, then they will drop into your podcast app. Lovely. See you next time.